States, which is where I got my PhD, in fact, although I don't know her personally. She was not there when I was there. She wrote in the IMF journal, this is their online journal called Finances and Development, in 2024, an article, and she said, the necessity of drastic change in economics has never been more urgent. Okay? So I'm wondering why you think Jayati Ghosh might have said that. Why does she think that the need for drastic change in economics has never been so urgent? Does anyone have a thought? No?
Because
Yes.
of many processes that are transforming economics and societies in general around the world.
Yeah, okay, great. Yes, so in fact, we can kind of organize the thinking of those processes into what some people are calling triple crisis, okay? The triple crisis of social sustainability. So what are those crises? So one issue that we one way we can think about the crisis is the crisis of unpaid work. So this creates a crisis of human sustainability because in this time, populations across the world are becoming older. And as I'm going to talk about more in a little while, this increases the demands for care. There are more people who need care. And so one crisis is the crisis of human sustainability. How will we care for the aging population in our societies? The second crisis, obviously, is the climate crisis, right? The crisis of climate sustainability, the reproduction of the climate. And the third crisis is the crisis of inequality, right? The massive economic inequality in the globe. And so I think that when Professor Jayati Ghosh talks about the urgent need for change, it's because the science of economics does not provide us with the tools that we need to solve these problems. But I will try to convince you that feminist economics will give us the needed tools for solving these problems. So I want to start by saying that I don't think that standard economics is useless, right? Standard economics provides many important tools for us. So what are some of those important tools? Well, it provides an analytical framework for understanding individual behaviors and decision-making. And standard economics provides us with many important empirical tools for understanding patterns and relationships between variables over time. And of course, standard economics provides us with macroeconomic models, which help us understand how all the individual behaviors add up to something bigger than the individuals. So those are all very important contributions of standard economics. But feminist economists argue that standard economics makes some very big mistakes, right? Leaves out some very important things. So I want to talk now about what those things are that are missing from standard economics. So how many people recognize this picture? Something like this picture. Does it look familiar? Raise your hand. Or yeah, it looks a little familiar, right? If you took an economics class, you saw this picture, right? And this, when you study economics, this is a picture of the economy, right? That's what's being shown here. So it shows that in the economy, households send factors of production, labor, and savings to firms, right? And firms send goods and services to households. And then we have the monetary side of both of those things, right? And that's the economy. But notice that when we say that the economy is described completely and totally by this picture, we're saying that the economy consists only of things that go through the market, right? The economy is things that go through the market. But if you think about the economy in a little bit bigger way, so for example, some people have argued that a good way to define the economy is the way that human beings organize their material existence, right? All the things that human beings need to do to survive, that's the economy. Well, then this picture leaves out some very important things. Can anybody think of something that's missing from the picture? Sorry? Care work. The household, right? So here, households just send workers into the labor market, right? But we don't see any production happening in the household. No, households just send workers, right? So feminist economists argue that there's a lot of production that takes place in the home, right? So there's a lot of cooking and cleaning and care and laundry, right? Things that take place in the home. Now, notice that those exact same things get produced for the market, right? They get produced for the market. You can buy cooking, you can buy cleaning, you can buy childcare, and when it takes place in the market, that's part of the economy. But if it takes place in the home, that's not part of the economy, right? So feminist economists say, you know, that doesn't make sense. That's the same work. It should count as part of the economy no matter where it takes place, right? So this picture is from a poster from the 1930s. And what the poster designer is showing us here is that people go to the factory, right? And they come out of the factory at the end of the day. They're hungry, they're tired, they're dirty. And then they come into their household where they get repaired, right? They get fed and cleaned and so on. And then the next day they can go back into the factory, right? So the idea here is that there is production of workers in the home, right? We're producing workers. And what I like a lot about this poster is notice that the poster designer has shown the household as an assembly line, right? So she's really giving us that idea that the household is so much like the factory in being productive, right? So feminist economists argue that these things, which are currently not part of the economy, need to be brought into our analysis in order to do better economics. So that the household is one example of a resource, a product that has no price, right? The cooking and cleaning and childcare in the household is not part of the economy because it doesn't have a price. And we can make the exact same argument about what are sometimes called nature services. Okay, so we use many free, unpriced products from nature in our production, right? Clean air, clean water, biodiversity, green space, all of those things are used in production. But because they don't have a price and they don't go through markets, then they don't get included in economic analysis, right? And so again, feminist economists point out that if you don't include them in your economic analysis, how are we going to solve climate change, right? We don't have the tools. So that's the first point that feminist economists make, that the economy, that our economic science needs to look at all the things that we need to survive, including unpaid work in the household, including unpaid nature services. The second main point that I want to make about feminist economics is that they challenge the idea that all of us are equally free to make the same sets of decisions. And instead, feminist economists argue that the economy is characterized by structural differences between people, right? And of course, here the particular example is structural differences by gender. So this picture is something I borrowed from the World Bank. It's not a very radical publication. And what they're trying to show us here is that markets, formal institutions, households, informal institutions are all places where people are going to experience inequality, right? So for example, formal institutions. In many countries in the world, it's still the case that women cannot access credit in the same way that men can, right? So there's a structural inequality in formal institutions. Markets. So markets seem like something which would be very gender neutral, right? What's gendered about markets? But the fact is that men and women, or black people and white people in many countries, or people from different ethnic groups, are going to come to markets with different capabilities, right? Different assets, different skills, and so on. And so markets are going to treat people differently, right? Informal institutions like social norms obviously affect people differently. And then, of course, in households, we know that people have different roles, they have different participation in decision-making, and so on. So all of those inequalities make this kind of depiction of the economy. So those of you who are economists in the audience, right, you know that we think about people having a utility function, and then they just maximize their utility. And nobody in this framework thinks about how that might be really different for different people, except when we talk about their budget constraint, right? So feminist economists are saying, you know, that's not sufficient to understand people's differences, just to think they have different budget constraints. We need to understand how all these institutions affect them differently. So that's a second key point of feminist economics. A third key point is to argue that the whole purpose of the economy should be different. So if you think about what's the goal of an economy, you can go all the way back to Adam Smith and see that the idea has been historically that the purpose of economics is to make the economy grow faster. The goal of economics or the economy is economic growth. But feminist economists argue that the goal of economics and of the economy should be different. It should be human well-being. Now, of course, many economists might say, well, if you have more economic growth, you'll have more well-being. And to a certain extent, that's true, right? Economic growth over the centuries has given us better health care, better nutrition, better housing, and so on. But it's not always the same. If you think about right now, and I have a certain amount of money, there are ways that I could invest it that would give us higher economic growth, but they might not give us more human welfare, right? So I could invest it in health care, or maybe I could invest it in luxury condos for Jeff Bezos and people like him, right? So one might give more economic growth. The millionaires will pay a lot for those fancy condominiums. And of course, healthcare for poor people is not going to bring us very much profit, so not much economic growth, but it might contribute more to human well-being. So feminist economists have said, well, we need to focus on the well-being part as the end goal, and economic growth only as a tool if it gets us there. These two quotes just show you the change in the way economics has thought about this issue. So in 1920, Marshall, everybody know Alfred Marshall? He's kind of the father of microeconomics. You know, here he is saying that well-being is a really important goal of economics. And Robbins, I'm sorry I left off the date here, this is from only the 1930s, so about 10 years, 15 years later, Robbins has switched our attention away from well-being to the kind of current thinking about economics, about being very efficient with scarce resources, and that basically is the same thing as saying maximizing economic growth. So there was this big change in economics, and feminist economists argue that this was not the right thing to do. Okay, so some economists would say, well, you know, maximizing the efficiency in the Robbins sense is the same thing as maximizing human efficiency. So there's the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Anybody been thinking about the second fundamental theorem? No? So it's kind of a specialized thing, but economists argue that you shouldn't have to worry about the distribution of income. Just maximize productivity, maximize growth, and then after you've done that, you can just distribute the resources any way you want. So you don't have to worry about distribution, just worry about growth, right? But feminist economists argue that that fundamental theorem of welfare economics is wrong. Okay, it's wrong. Because first of all, to maximize growth means taking a set of prices, right? And then maximizing growth given those prices. But what if those prices are wrong? What if those prices put zero value on unpaid work, right? Or zero value on biodiversity, or zero value on clean air, right? Then if you maximize economic growth, given those wrong prices, you might not maximize human well-being, right? And secondly, I find it difficult to believe that, think about how much inequality we have right now, okay? So some people don't have any education, they don't have good health, they probably don't vote because they're not, able to spend time thinking about politics, right? And suppose that we maximize growth under these conditions. And then after that, we turn around to those people who are suffering and raising their children and getting sick under all that inequality, and we say, here's some money. Do you think that works? Does that make them equal now? No, right? Their kids have grown up without good health care, without good schooling. They themselves have health problems, right? So feminist economists reject the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics and argue that we need to focus on human well-being as a specific goal, right? And not think about first we're going to maximize output and then worry about that later. Okay, so I want to wrap up this part by introducing you to this person if you don't know her. Does anybody recognize this person? Yes, who is it? Yeah, very good. This is Eleanor Ostrom. Anybody know why she's on this slide? Why do I have her there? Yeah, she's the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. Okay? In fact, her PhD is not in economics, was not. Her PhD was in political science, but she did a lot of economics and she won a Nobel Prize in economics. So this is a quote from her. And what she says here is that gendered economics is good economics. It's good science and it's good econometrics. Okay? What is she saying there? What she's saying there is that gendered economics or feminist economics is not about women. It's about doing economics in a better way, right? In a way that recognizes those parts of human reproduction which are excluded from markets as being important, unpaid work, unpriced resources. It's a way of doing economics which recognizes structural inequality, and it's a way of doing economics which prioritizes human well-being, right? That's what she's saying. That's good economics. So feminist economics, I'm going to argue, is important as a way of doing economics, not necessarily only as a way of understanding gender issues. Okay, so one last point about feminist economics before I go on and explain how it's going to address those three crises I was talking about. Some of you may know that economics considers itself a positive science, right? That means that we don't think about in economics what should be, right? We just deal with the facts. Okay, so feminist economists reject that idea. And they argue that the purpose of feminist economics is to change the world, to make it a better place to solve the triple crises I was talking about, right? So they don't necessarily consider this a positive science, but they accept that some of their positions may be normative, right? May be arguing for certain kinds of outcomes. Okay, I think I'll skip this and that. Oh, sorry, let me go back. Let me at least talk about this one. So sometimes people ask me, so gender economics, feminist economics, what's the difference? And so I want to take 1 minute and address that. So feminist economics, as I have just explained, tries to be a completely different way of doing economics, right? Whereas gender analysis in economics is a framework in economics for understanding that not all people are the same and for really looking at the difference between men and women. So if you think about, like, many papers look at the gender wage gap, for example, or differences in labor force participation between men and women. So those would be gender analysis in economics, right? But papers which really try to look at the way that structural inequality contributes to the wage gap, right? Or that look at some of the different ways that we could get human welfare, human well-being, those would be feminist economics. So it's a bigger framework for thinking about doing economics differently, whereas gender analysis in economics is kind of a smaller framework for looking at some specific kinds of questions. Okay. Okay, so now I want to talk about the triple crisis. So the first crisis that I was talking about is the crisis of human sustainability, right? And this addresses the fact that in all countries across the globe, we are experiencing an aging of the population. So right now I'm doing a Fulbright in Brazil. I'm spending 4 months in Brazil. And I don't think that's, yeah, no, that's not on here. Okay, so the population pyramid, I don't know, how many of you ever looked at a population pyramid? Yeah, not that many people. Okay, so the population pyramid, basically, it shows how many people there are in different age groups in the population. And what the population pyramid traditionally has shown is a big bulge toward the middle and maybe even the bottom, so that most people in the population were in the wage-earning years. And what we see now, like Brazil, for example, used to have a kind of a big bulge, so it would be like a kind of like two triangles, right? A big bulge in the middle. And now what we see in Brazil, for example, is that every age category, by 2060, every age category is going to be more or less the same, okay? So there's going to be the same amount of people in each age group, which means the same amount of people not earning any money, right, as the amount of people earning money. So what this diagram here is showing us is this, that in 1990, not very long ago, at least not for me, there were, a large number of people working in their work clothes here, right, supporting older people who were no longer working. But now in 2025, there are many fewer people in the working ages who can support the older people. So what do we mean by support? Well, sometimes we just mean actually caring for them if they need care. But we also mean something more fiscal, right? We mean that these people in the working ages are paying taxes, and they're paying into the pension funds, and they're therefore providing the money that governments need to support these older people. So as we move from here to here, we have this crisis of reproduction, both inside the family, where we don't have enough people to provide actual physical care, and at the fiscal level, where we don't have enough revenue to provide the care that older people need. So this is the crisis of human reproduction that I'm talking about. So here I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on inside the household and how that affects this crisis. So thanks to feminist economists who really put a lot of pressure in 1995 at the big UN meeting in Beijing, there are now over 170 countries in the world that collect time use surveys. So time use surveys are a very interesting statistical tool. So household members are given a diary, and they need to write down for every 10 minutes all day long what they did yesterday. So the surveyor asks them, what time did you wake up? And you say, 6 o'clock. And they begin by saying, from 6 o'clock until 6:10, what did you do? And you fill out all day long what you did. And then we end up with data on how people spend their time. And it's a way of measuring the production inside households, which until recently had been invisible to economists. So this table shows you the ratio between men and women in the different uses of their time. So if you look at paid work here, you see that women spend about half as much time as men in paid work, right? So that means they contribute to taxes about half as much as men, and they pay into the pension funds about half as much as men. And what do you think they're doing with their time when they're not in paid work? Care work, yeah, and household work, right? So if we look at the ratio of direct care work, that means actually physically taking care of someone, we see that women spend 3 to almost 6 times as much time as men in care work. And then if we look at indirect care, that means like cooking and cleaning and washing for people who cannot do that themselves, right? People who are dependent. And we see that in indirect care, we have between about 2 and 6 times as much time that women spend in that instead of men, right? So women are spending a lot of time doing this kind of activity and not paid work. So governments who are thinking about their fiscal problem with the aging population have been looking at this and asking the question, how can we get more of those women who are doing all this unpaid work into the paid sector so that they can pay more taxes and pay more pension contributions and therefore help us care for the aging population, right? So this is just a graph which shows us the relationship between unpaid work and paid work. So this on the horizontal axis is the gap between men and women and their time in unpaid work. And on the vertical axis, we have the female labor force participation rate, okay? And these are all countries, different countries here, right? And what do you see? You see a negative relationship, right? The bigger the gender gap in unpaid work, the lower the female labor force participation rate, right? So that's just kind of evidence about the cause for this crisis. So South Korea is one of the countries in the world that has the biggest problem right now already of an aging population. They have a birth rate which is below the replacement rate. They have very low birth rate. And so the South Korean government is wondering, how are we going to care for all these older people? And how can we get more women who are at home doing unpaid work into the labor force and to be paying more into the pension funds and taxes? So the South Korean government has worked with us at American University to develop a macroeconomic model which will allow us to look at the relationship between the paid sector and the unpaid sector. So if you think about it for a minute, macroeconomic models right now, everything that happens in the home is invisible, right? It doesn't get included in macroeconomic models. It's not part of the economy, and there are no prices, right? So what feminist economists have started to do is to include the unpaid and the paid care sectors in macroeconomic models. How do we do that? Well, we have all that time use data that tells us how much time is spent in all these activities. We know what people are doing in the unpaid sector now. So we just have to multiply those quantities of time, hours, times the price per hour for that activity, right? And then we can include it in the macroeconomic models. And so countries already do that. So does everybody know that the system that we use to collect the data for calculating GDP is called the System of National Accounts, right? That's a standardized system for collecting the data to measure GDP. And the UN now has an official set of statistical rules for collecting the data on unpaid work that I was just talking about. It doesn't get included in GDP yet because feminist economists have not convinced people yet that we need to do that. But it gets included in a separate category of system of national accounts. So we have all our system of national accounts that goes into GDP, and then we have like additional rows at the bottom for all the unpaid work, and we collect that data. So to make the macroeconomic model with the care sector, we're just using that data that's already being collected and being incorporated into a macroeconomic model so that has a specific care sector, paid and unpaid. So the Korean government wanted us to develop this macroeconomic model that has the care sector in it so we can see what's going on there. And then we simulated, using that model, the impact of some policy changes. So for example, what happens if we increase spending on childcare by 0.15% of GDP? What happens if we increase spending on elder care by 0.15% of GDP? And then what happens if we do two other things? We reduce the gender wage gap so that women have more incentive to go to work. And maybe some of you know, wages in care work are very low. Wages for people who take care of children are very low. Wages for people who take care of old people are very low. So the other policy simulation was, what if we reduce the gap in the wages for people who give care so that they're farther from the mean, they're closer to the mean wage. Okay, so here I'm just giving you one little taste of what we can show by doing this. So what we're showing here is the impact of those policy changes. So the blue bars are the child care policy, the orange bars are the elder care policy, and the gray bars are the wage gap. I'll skip the other ones for now. Okay, so first you see on the top there that the impact of that spending on child care and on health care, not very surprisingly, increases GDP, right? Because we're hiring more child care workers, we're building more child care centers, we're hiring people to help take care of old people, and so on. So it increases GDP. But what's really amazing about this for me is that that part that used to be invisible, that was not part of the economy, is now visible here. This is the non-GDP part of the economy, right? That's the production that takes place inside the home, right? And we see that those policies really dramatically reduce the production that's taking place inside the home, right? So those policies are moving people out of the unpaid work in the home and into the paid care sector, right? Oh, and maybe I should say one other thing. So the people who worked on the macroeconomic model were concerned about whether the impact of the spending would only affect households with children or old people. Because politically that makes it a little difficult, right? We're gonna take this 0.15% of GDP and we're gonna spend it on this policy, but it only affects households with children or with old people. What about the other households? So they looked at how these changes affect the income of different categories of households, which you can do in a macroeconomic model, right? You can break out your results by different types of households. And what it turns out is that all households, all types of households, have increased income from this, not just households with children and not just households with older people. Okay, so what I've tried to argue now was that the tools provided by feminist economics, that is looking inside households and also collecting data on unpaid work, have given us tools to address the demographic crisis, right? We now have some more tools to address this. So what I want to address next is the crisis climate and the way that these, in my view, very same tools can be used to help us address climate crisis. So just as a little motivation, Latin America only produces about 10% of greenhouse gases. And yet Latin America is the recipient of all manner of climate disasters, right? So as I mentioned already, I'm spending some time in Brazil, and I recently read that in Brazil, 82% of municipalities have already experienced impacts of climate change, okay? So this is already something that all of us need to be thinking about. So my argument is this. So the feminist economists have encouraged us to figure out how to put prices on unpriced goods, right? Household work, in order to include them in our economic analysis. And we can do exactly the same thing for nature services, okay? So how do you do that? Well, the same thing. You count up the amount of nature services that you use, and then you attribute a price to those services, right? So this company called Ecosystems Capital has done this, and in doing that, what they concluded is that nature services contribute between $6 and $12 billion annually to the global economy. So, but right now, those services, those $6 to $12 billion of services are invisible to economists. They're not included in the economy because they don't have prices on them, right? So my argument would be that we can use those same tools that we've already developed to make visible this unpaid resource so that we can include it in GDP and include it in all of our economic analyses. So I have one more little point to add to that in terms of, I think this would be really important in addressing climate change. So one other thing that we all consume and really enjoy consuming that is not included in GDP is leisure, right? Leisure is very important to all of us, and it's very valuable to all of us. We will pay to have more leisure, but we don't include this in GDP. And we don't include it in our economic analysis. So, but it would be so easy to do so, because the time use surveys that I told you about already collect the data on leisure. We ask, how much time did you spend in paid work? How much time did you spend in unpaid work? How much time did you spend in self-care, that's like sleeping and bathing and so on? And how much time did you spend in leisure, right? So we have this data. And we have mechanisms for figuring out how much it's worth to people, which I'm happy to talk about in the questions if you would like. And in fact, the OECD and the UN already have created monetary values and estimates for the value of the leisure that we consume. So, for example, one of the estimates suggested that if we include our free time in GDP, it would raise GDP by about 20%, okay? So this is not some kind of crazy magic. We already know how to do it. We even do it. We just haven't included it in GDP. Okay. Oh, right. So I think this has important potential, not just for doing economics, but also politically, right? So right now, you know, there are some environmentalists who argue that we should have zero growth, or maybe that we should have slower growth in order to reduce the damage that we're doing to the climate. But reducing growth or having slower growth or no growth is politically really difficult, right? People don't want to be told that they should have fewer televisions or, you know, less stuff, or that their standard of living should be reduced, right? That's a difficult thing to ask people. So, but politically, one thing that we can do is if we put monetary values on care and on environmental resources and on leisure, that, and we include that in GDP, what's going to happen to GDP? It's going to go up, right? Because all these things that we're consuming right now but not including in GDP are going to be now included in GDP, right? So it's going to look bigger. And since it looks bigger politically, it might be a little easier to produce less, you know, climate emission creating stuff, right? Less, maybe fewer cars, or less coal, right, or some other things. So that it's a kind of a political trick where people will realize some things that they're consuming already and start to value them, right? And then we could instead reduce some other things. Okay, so conclusions. So feminist economists argue that we need to do a few basic things. We need to recognize things that we consume which are not produced in the market. We need to recognize structural inequalities. And we need to really center human well-being in our economic goals. And I think that if we do these things, as encouraged by feminist economists, we will have the tools, or at least more tools, that we need in order to address these triple crises of inequality, fiscal crisis, and climate crisis. And I want to just add a little footnote here, because I haven't talked too much tonight about inequality, right? So, but I want to say that I think that addressing the crises of human reproduction and the climate crises will do a lot to help us address inequality. Because we know that the households where women are unable to participate in the labor force because they need to be providing care are households with fewer economic resources, right? They're the women who aren't able to go to work because they can't afford, given their low wages, to hire childcare workers or to hire someone to help take care of their aging parent. So if we had better care policies, those women would better be able to earn income and to participate in the economy, and we'd have less inequality. And secondly, we have a lot of evidence that shows that climate crisis affects low-income households and marginalized households more than wealthier households, right? The lower-income people are less able to relocate when an area becomes prone to flooding, right? They're less able to find a different job if their agricultural land becomes unproductive, and so on. So climate crisis and the crisis of care and human reproduction are crises which contribute to inequality. And the more that we address those crises, the more we'll be able to begin reducing some of the sources of inequality. Okay, so I'm going to stop there so we can have a discussion about these ideas, and I'm open to your comments and your questions too.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Abrimos entonces este espacio de discusión y de preguntas. Quiero iniciar la discusión con un par de preguntas. Table 7 shows data about the ratio of women's average time to men's average time. How have these rates for total work, paid work, direct care, and indirect care evolved over the past decades? Have they increased or decreased? What might have been the impact of globalization processes since the 80s? And a second question, perhaps it's more general, what do you think might be the consequences in the coming years of recent technological advances related to the development of artificial intelligence and digital platforms on the structural inequalities that currently persist, as well as on unpaid work and care-related activities? Okay, I don't know if you want to answer, or perhaps we make more questions. Okay. Someone wants to make a question or comment? Okay.
Okay, so your question about the trends. So it's interesting. Of course, over the past decades, women have taken up paid work more, right? And what we see is that when women take up more paid work, their unpaid work does decline, but not at all on a one-to-one ratio, right? So women might take up more work and their unpaid work decreases typically a little bit, right? So the trends have not been as dramatic as we might imagine, yeah. And another, important question, since you asked about technology, is to what extent does technology change unpaid work? And this also gives kind of interesting results, typically what happens, of course, it differs across contexts and all different kinds of things, but what often happens is that when some kind of technological breakthrough reduces the amount of time required for one kind of unpaid care work or unpaid work, your time just shifts into some other kind of unpaid work, right? So women used to have to spend a lot more time doing housework because they didn't have as efficient technology, and as they did less housework, they spend more time doing childcare, right? So I work a lot on countries in Asia, and Kazakhstan and Mongolia, and I also have a paper on Tajikistan. And one of the really interesting things we see is that opportunities for paid work, in a way, come first. And then after because people are poor, right? And they need income to survive. So people take up paid work, but then unpaid work is very difficult to reduce a lot, right? So many people in the world have to search to find water, right? Spend a lot of time fetching water or fetching fuel to cook or to heat. And you can't not do those things. And just because you have income doesn't mean you can buy a market substitute, right? Think of all the places where there is no market to buy, things that you might need. So what happens is it's actually care that goes down. People increase their paid work, and they can't get rid of their unpaid work because they need to collect water, they need to collect fuel, they have to feed their family, they have to wash the laundry, and so they do less care, right? And you can probably imagine, like in a rural village in Colombia, mothers and fathers don't spend very much time caring for their children, right? Not in the way, I don't know, in our families in the United States, parents are constantly taking their children to soccer and tutoring them in their schoolwork and doing all these extra things, right? So care ends up being the thing that can expand and contract, right? And parents end up, so in Mongolia, parents have to go and take care of the animals because they need them to survive. They have to leave their babies inside the house. It's very cold in the winter in Mongolia. There's no one to care for them. They tie the babies to the bed. That's how they provide care, right? So care, and I'm not trying to say the Mongolians are barbarian or something like that at all. No, it's just that that's the solution. It's the time in care that has to shrink, right? Instead of the time in paid work or the time in some of the other kinds of work. So I think that's an interesting finding, right? That care ends up being the thing that we can somehow decrease. On the digital divide, I'm not exactly sure what you were thinking about, and feel free to explain more, but there's been a lot of questions in the United States and in Europe about whether robots will be able to take over caring for our elderly parents, right? Because we don't have enough people to care for them. Maybe robots could do that, right? So, but so far, it seemed very limited, our ability to automate that kind of work. So I guess thinking about your question about AI, some of those things could. For example, a thing that I'm thinking about is that one type of care that older people often report is missing is companionship. Their children make sure that they're fed and housed, and if they need help bathing, they make sure that they have someone to help them with that. But then their children have to run off to work, and all day long, these older people are sitting lonely and bored and sad. And that's what they report when you ask what more care do you need. And you can kind of imagine AI maybe could have a role there, right? Especially, well, in many different ways. So I can see that. And if you have another thought that I didn't occur to me, feel free to.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Meurs. I have a question about active care that houses children in South Africa is 10. It's very different compared to other countries.
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. So you remember I said that the methodology for this is established by the United Nations, right? Under an agreement that we needed to collect this data. So there are two methods. most countries in the world use the diary method that I described to you. Every 10 minutes, all day long, what did you do yesterday? In Latin America, most countries do it differently. Instead, what they ask is for a certain set of activities, maybe like 5 activities, how much time did you spend yesterday doing childcare? How much time did you spend yesterday in paid work, right? So these 2 different methodologies give you very different results, because the Latin American method does not limit what you report. So you can report crazy amounts of time. You know, in some cases I saw people said they spent more than 400 hours a week fetching water. Okay, it's not possible. So the time diary, it limits, because you only have between 6 a.m. when you woke up and 10 p.m. when you went to sleep, and you can put in every 10 minutes, but you can't put in any more time than that, right? So that's one thing. There's different methods. But, you know, the point is also, so South Africa and Ghana and China and South Korea use the same method, and they have different numbers, right? So they're also, we don't know exactly, and it's something that people are studying, but one issue is people's recognition of things as work, right? So the numbers for elder care are tiny. These are very tiny numbers. How much time do you spend taking care of an older person during the day? It's very small. And even if we limit the sample to people, to households with someone over 75 years of age who's more likely to need care, the numbers remain tiny. Why? So we think that people just don't recognize things that they're doing as care. So we collect this category of time in supervisory care. So what this means is that I'm not actively watching my child, but I can't leave the house because my child is only 4, and I cannot leave her alone in the house. So I cannot go and do work, I can't run errands, I have to be here. So that's called supervisory care. And so maybe a big chunk of elder care is that kind of being there, right? Or the companionship I talked about. And people just don't recognize it as care, and they don't report it. So that's possible, right? And so it's possible that South Africans think about the issue differently. They recognize care more, maybe, right? That's possible. And also, another possible reason is that this data is collected for all household members. That means that we collect data for live-in housekeepers or live-in babysitters. Anybody who works for the household but lives here is a household member, right? So it's possible that in South Africa, some of this data is live-in babysitters, nannies, housekeepers, right? And that's also a possibility, but I don't know. And again, it's something that people recognize and are trying to understand better.
Bueno, gracias por la explicación. ¿Hay alguna otra, another question or comment por acá? Okay.
Hi. The presentation was like really interesting, so thank you for that. I like the concept that you present as feminist, like the care work and the environmental services and the leisure. That was like, I didn't hear that before. But I have a question about the calculus of the GDP, because it's like, well, we can include these things in the GDP calculus, but there are societies that it's like women have fewer rights, and it's like they can't be out if they don't have their dad's permission or siblings' permission if they're like male companion. So it's like, what do we do in that case? Because it's like social things that we can, I don't think that we can make, we can make a price of that. I don't know, it's like social things. And how can we incorporate this to the GDP calculus, or?
Okay. So I think we already do that, right? Because right now, all countries in the world report GDP numbers, but women's participation in the economy in these countries is very different, right? But we include it in standardized GDP anyway. So I mean, I take what you're saying about the differences, but I'm not sure that it really, that I see how it connects to whether or not we should include this in GDP, because those differences exist now, and we include women's work in GDP now, right? So I think, you know, the problem we have now is that some countries, like Tanzania, for example, 60% of Tanzania's economy is outside of markets. That is, it's unpaid work of some kind, or environmental services or whatever, right? And some other countries have, say, 20% of their GDP outside of markets, like the UK. So right now, we compare Tanzania and the UK looking at their GDP numbers. I feel like it's not a fair comparison, right? Because we're including everything for the UK, but like half of what Tanzania does, we don't include it. Right? That's not a fair comparison. So I think that comparisons are unfair in general, and so it's just like another form of unfairness. I don't think it would fix it all, if that's what you want to say. Yeah, I think that that's true. But I think in some ways it would equalize it, and I think that bringing those unpaid works into the economy and making them visible might help with some of those inequalities, right? So where women are secluded and do most of their production in the home, right now all that production it's not production, right? It doesn't count. And if we incorporate that production into GDP, then they become more equal members, because that production that they do in the home now counts toward the economy, right? So maybe it actually helps them get a little bit more recognition.
Bueno, buenas noches. Pues yo sí voy a hacer la pregunta en español.
Okay.
Bueno, primero quería agradecerte por la presentación, sí, estuvo muy interesante. Mi duda era relacionado sobre la introducción del trabajo no pago dentro del GDP, relacionado a si consideras que con la introducción de esto, o sea, se podría sostener la hipótesis de que de pronto los países en desarrollo o los países más pobres pueden tener, en términos per cápita, mayor valor relacionado a actividades no pagas que los países ricos. Esto en miras de ver si con implementar esto en las medidas del GDP podría disminuir las disparidades en términos de el valor entre los países pobres y los países ricos.
Yeah, so if I understood the question is, will it reduce the inequalities in GDP between the countries? And I think it will, absolutely. Yeah, because all countries produce, you know, a lot of things that don't get counted, but it's poor countries that produce more things that don't get counted. And so it would, in fact, reduce the inequality. Now, of course, maybe you would say that that's not so good, right? Because now Tanzania will look less poor, and maybe it will get less help, right? So that is an issue. But it helps us, I think it's very important analytically. I didn't use this example in my talk, sometimes I do, but there's this famous example from, I think it's from Kenneth Arrow, a very famous economist, but it's old. It's like from maybe the 1960s. But he said, if you marry your housekeeper, GDP goes down, right? Because your housekeeper was doing cooking and cleaning and washing, and it was going into the GDP because she's a paid worker. Now you marry her, she's your wife, and she does the cooking and cleaning and washing, but she doesn't get paid. And now it's not in the GDP anymore, and it goes down, right? So the problem with that is that when we don't include the unpaid work, it's invisible. We can't see it, right? We can't see what happens. So think about two policy examples why it really matters. Think about a recession. In a recession, people lose their jobs. They lose their jobs, so they take their kids out of childcare, they don't go out to dinner, they stop sending their clothes to the laundry, they wash them at home, right? And so all of that production disappears from GDP. And it looks like we're not consuming that anymore. But we are consuming that, right? We're still eating, we're still doing our laundry, we're still caring for our children, but we're doing it at home, right? So when we look at how much GDP fell during the recession, we're overestimating how much consumption we lost, because part of it is just invisible, right? And then the opposite example is take austerity, okay? The government says, no, we're too poor, we need to cut back. And we stop providing government-funded childcare, we stop providing government-funded healthcare, we stop providing government-provided, I don't know, recreation, okay? And it looks like, oh, we saved all that money. We didn't spend that money, right? But, you know, someone is doing that. Someone is caring for those children. Someone is providing that food. Someone is providing that recreation for those kids. But we don't see those costs. Those costs got invisibilized, right? And they often get invisibilized onto women because they're the ones in the household that replace government services when they're cut during austerity, right? So our current economic models, which keep the unpaid work invisible, are not useful for policy analysis, right? Because you can't follow things when they move between what is now the unpaid sector and the paid sector. They keep disappearing on you and you can't keep track of them, right? So if we include all of this into GDP or some people say, well, it shouldn't be GDP, that has its purpose, and it should be something else. I'm fine with that. Give it a different name, GDP plus, let's call it, right? But at least we have a tool which allows us to follow things when they move between these different sectors, and we can have a much better analysis. And the same thing with, the environmental resources. Suppose that we stop using some free environmental resource to save the planet, and instead we use a resource we have to pay for, right? Now it looks like costs went up. No. Costs didn't go up. We just replaced something that we forgot to pay for because it didn't have a price on it, right? We still have a cost. It's just a different one. But we can't see that now because those environmental resources have no price on them, right? Put a price on them, we'll be able to track when we move from one to the other. So I think it will give us an important tool.
Hello. I'm gonna try to do it in English, but I'm gonna do my best. I want to ask. For me, it's very interesting to hear another way to see economics, but I really want to ask how we can change the target of the meaning of economics. I mean, when we hear all the economic people, like presidents, everyone is talking about growing, about money and everything. And I want to know how we can change, what about the discussion worldwide? Because when I hear about, for example, Donald Trump, I don't feel that, in this case, Donald Trump think that economics is about, or for example, have in mind, I don't know, climate change and everything. So I want to know what do you think about how we can do to change the target of economics in that way?
Okay, thanks for that question. So, sometimes what I've been talking about here is to put prices on things that don't have prices, right? But some people find that really offensive, right? So, my care for my child, you shouldn't value that at the price of a childcare worker. No, my love and, the kind of input I provide into my child is priceless, right? Don't put a price on that. Or, you want to put a price on biodiversity. Well, that's wrong, right? That's just an invaluable thing. And if we put a price on it, that means that, well, some rich person could come along and say, I'll give you that much money, get rid of biodiversity, right? So that's wrong. So, and feminist economists are divided on this. Like, some of us are arguing that we should put prices on things so we can include them in the analysis. And others are saying, no, that's wrong. We shouldn't give in to everything having to have a dollar value attached to it, right? Or a peso value or whatever. So the argument that I've been making tonight about putting prices on things is actually what I think of as kind of a compromise to address the fact that some people don't want to deal with these issues, right? So we come and we say, well, we think that, you know, you need to value unpaid work in the household. Many of us spend our lives doing it. It's valuable. And so how can I make you see it's valuable? Oh, I could put a price on it, right? And then I could put it in the macroeconomic model and show you what happens when it disappears, right? And then now you're going to see why it matters, right? So this itself is kind of a strategy to deal with that. I'm not going to say we're going to convince Donald Trump. But I think it is a way that we have successfully convinced some policymakers. I mean, I think even here in Colombia, you know, a lot of Dane, your National Statistical Office, is one of the leaders in collecting time use data. You have one of the best time use surveys that there is. So those of you who are looking for a thesis topic, you know, keep that in mind. And so Colombia is able to produce evidence, right, using these methodologies to show to your policymakers that certain things are, you know, a good idea. I mean, one other example I have that I'd like to talk about is some studies that an organization of the United Nations, UN Women, has done. So everybody's always arguing we need more childcare, right? But of course the policymakers always say, well, that's very important, but we don't have money, you know, we can't afford it. So the UN organization has been using not the macroeconomic models that I showed you, but something smaller and easier to do, which is kind of a partial model. And what they do is they simulate what would happen if we spend, for example, 0.15% of GDP on childcare. And they show, okay, well, it would cost this much. It would cost this much for the centers, this much for the teachers, this much for the, I don't know, lunches, you know, and so on. And here's the cost. And then they say, and as a result, this many more women will take up paid work. And they will earn this much income, and they will pay this much taxes, and they will pay this much into Social Security. And so the government will lose money by spending on the cost of childcare, but they will win or gain money by the taxes and pension payment. And what these little models show is that the childcare won't be free, too bad about that, you know, but it's greatly offset. The cost of childcare is greatly offset by the increased fiscal revenues that come from more women working and paying into pension funds. And something that's really interesting, I think, is that these studies have been done in a number of different kinds of countries. So I looked at studies from Slovenia and Serbia and some Latin American cases and African cases. There were 5 African cases which were studied. And you know, sadly, one thing that was shown is that in the African cases, you get very little fiscal offset. And do you know why? It's because the economies are so highly informal. So they build childcare centers, more women go to work, but they work in the informal sector. So they don't pay taxes, and they don't pay into the pension fund. And so the government, of course, there is some economic benefit because more women are working, but you don't get the same fiscal offset that helps you pay for the childcare. So I think those are very interesting studies which help us kind of, you know, convince policymakers, although, as I said, in the African cases, they turned out not to be that convincing.
Okay.
First, thank you for your talk. Non-paid work has been growing for everybody, and not only for women. As a matter of fact, if you take all the claims that we have now for really paying the work of people in the whole world, at least in the capitalistic world, we will have a lot of demand for salaried work. And the question is, who's going to pay for those salaries, for those wages? As a matter of fact, today, part of the new jobs, they're not even salaried. They don't have salary. They don't have the health services. They don't have social insurance. They don't even, in some cases, they don't even pay for that. That's you call the precariat, but that is growing. So my question is this: we've been thinking in having some kind of payment for the care work done mostly by women. My point is, okay, who's going to pay for that? The state? The states are being dwindling, diminishing all over. the tendency and in the political economy of today is that the state has to be shrinking. Capitalistic, the producers or the owners of capital are making more of their money from the capital valorization in the markets of in financial markets. So the problem is, without that people that are not being paid for the work, who's going to pay for that work? And even people as reactionary as Elon Musk is saying that we're going to have a universal basic income. Because at this point, capitalism is not producing enough jobs, enough paid jobs. And on top of that, almost all of us are working for the digital platforms without being paid. Work all the time, every time that we go into the internet and we play with that, we tip on our computers. We're paying for, we're working for the digital platforms. Even in that sense, markets are disappearing also there because they have transactions, but they're no markets. So my point is, who's going to pay for that? What would be the political economy of that? Because of course it's important that women have some kind of payment for the care work. But in this situation, in this economy, in this point of development of capitalism, who's going to pay for that? And is there any other solution outside the state of the market? Is there any kind of a cooperative solution to that, or what kind of strategy you are visioning for that? You have any idea what to do about that?
So, okay, I liked your point a lot about the amount of production that takes place outside the market, free for, through the internet. I think that's a great point. But, the point I was trying to make is that it's not all costs, right? That when we invest money in childcare, elder care, it creates jobs that actually pay, right? And so you get increased production in the GDP sector, right? So that example I was giving about that the UN Women studied, where you spend money on childcare and women go to work and they pay taxes, those create multiplier effects, right? So I feel like we don't want to accept the idea that paying for care is only a cost. Paying for care is a cost, but it is offset by some benefits, right? Because those people who are being hired to do these things are in the GDP sector. They pay taxes and they pay into pension funds and they create revenue, right? So every time we spend money on care, we spend money on construction workers, we spend money on teachers, we spend money on food, right? We spend money on all those things. So, and those have multiplier effects. So going back to my UN Women example, I mean, remember that I said it was only a partial model, right? So it just looked at the impact on women who stopped giving care and went to work. It didn't look at the multiplier effects, right? So I stopped staying home and taking care of my child and I go to work. And now I hire childcare for my kid. I buy more groceries out, right? I have more disposable income, so I buy more things for myself or for my child, right? Those are all multiplier effects which aren't even in the UN models, right? So when we spend money on care, when states spend money on care, it's not just a cost because the state gets revenue back from that, right? And it gets money back directly as more people work and indirectly through the multiplier effect. So I'm not promising that it's free, right, that it's going to be completely offset, but I think we really have to reject the idea that it's just a cost. It's not just a cost. It creates a lot of economic benefits, right? So that's one thing. Your question about non-market solutions I think is really important. And I take your point about the precariat, and honestly, post-COVID, there's an interesting literature on the voluntary precariat, right? People, especially some young people, that are just rejecting the idea that their life has to be about capitalist production, right? And are doing something different. They create art, or they, live in casual jobs, precariat kind of jobs, and they just live like that. And that's find too, like not all care has to be provided through markets. I certainly wouldn't want to argue that. And actually there's an African-American researcher named Nina Banks who I think has made a really important argument about the level of community care. Like a lot, especially elder care, a lot of it, and so she's African-American, in the African-American community, a lot of elder care is provided by neighbors who check on their neighbor, right, who get their groceries for them, who help them do their laundry or whatever. So huge amounts of care do go on like that, right? And our data that I was showing you here doesn't collect that, because the time use data that we're using only looks at the time of people in your household. So anytime someone outside your household helps you, that's invisible still. We haven't figured out how to include that, right? So I think that's a really important way to provide care. But that's, I think, I mean, I don't know, I haven't thought a lot about it, but it's a little harder for me to think about policy that can help us solve that. But maybe one possible idea is just to give you the example of 2 European countries. So in Denmark, elders have a right to care. And the state provides the care that they need in a variety of ways. So elders can use their state resources that cover care to live in a residential facility for older people. And this is paid for with their tax dollars, right? And these institutions are run by the state and they're very high quality. But if they prefer, they can have their money paid to a child of theirs, an adult child, of course, or a neighbor to care for them. And then that caregiver gets a salary from the Danish government, and they have full labor rights. They get unemployment benefits, they get their pension paid, they have a paid vacation, they have paid sick days, right? And in Denmark, really interestingly, the majority of people choose a residential institution because they're very high quality, they have a very nice social life there with other people their age, they're not lonely, and they don't want to be a burden on their children. So my other example is Germany. Germany has a kind of similar program for family caregiver. They don't have full labor rights in Germany, but they have some labor rights, and they get a wage, not as good a wage as in Denmark, but they get a wage. And the parents, the elders, can choose whether it should be their child or a neighbor or someone else who gets this money. But in Germany, the state does not run residential institutions. Germany has a social welfare system which relies a lot on local organizations. So in a community, the community government runs the organizations, and they're often run by churches or other community organizations. So the local government collects the money, and they pay it to the church organization to run, say, day programs for elders, right? So that, I think, is closer to what you're thinking about. It's like a community organization, right? But the difference is that in that instance, the community organization which cares for the community elders is not left on its own trying to figure out how to pay for that, right? But the German government takes tax dollars and then redistributes them back to the community organizations to help fund that, right? So it's community, but in kind of a different way. So I don't know if I answered your question, but some thoughts.
Okay.
Many thanks for your interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. If you could elaborate on one or two aspects, because in your talk you mentioned that feminist economics implies doing economics otherwise, right? In a way, kind of opening up and including certain aspects or counting certain aspects of forms of activities that before has been either invisible or they've been absent in the analysis. My question is, that means, you are saying that the traditional economic models do not consider or did not consider that. But that also, sorry, I'm mixing Spanish and English. That implies that you have new way of thinking of care work as work. My question is, who decides that? Is it in certain dialogue with the existing economic models, or does it also imply a possibility of thinking of other categories emerging, through different type of research or methodological tools? And does economics or feminist economics implies that? Because the cases that you mentioned, examples in your presentations, it's more emphasizing the kind of macro models in which it's the economist using the same type of data, open up, measuring the others. But my question is, if you think about feminist ethics of doing research across social sciences, does this also imply certain kind of critical reappraisal of how can we collect data methodologically? And if so, how, what are kind of the debates, or how can we do it? Is it kind of more space for considering the, in different cases that you've been studying, the very way that the people themselves practice or see what is care, what is not, what is work, what is not? Because the cases would be, basically, if I understood in your presentation, I know it's like one talk, no? But I was wondering, it's still the same categories of economists, and we still work with the same categories and the same methods. We just open up and measure more things. But it's the dominant form of doing research that keep measuring the activities and labeling this is work. Also, let's include it and make it count, make it visible. But I was thinking, is there kind of other type of discussion methodologically or theoretically, or I don't know if it makes sense, but I hope so. Thank you.
A great question. Thank you. So yes, so the categories I was talking about, I think I mentioned they come from the UN. That's who decides. But your point is very well taken, and I talked a little bit before about, there are many different kinds of feminist economists, and there are definitely feminist economists who would say exactly what you just said, that this is very much like standard economics. We're putting prices on everything, we include them in our macroeconomic model. What about doing things differently? So I think that's very important, and there are many feminist economists that are trying to do things really differently, including like thinking about care, like, no, it shouldn't be a commodity. Like, let's think about a different way of thinking about this. So yes, and so that was one of the slides that I actually skipped, But so among feminist economists, there are people that do kind of standard econometric models, and the things I showed you tonight are mostly in that category. But then there are other ways of doing research which are really different, so ethnographic research, right? Or interviews where people are able to answer questions more like that about how do you think about this? And that's where, so one of the other colleagues, asked about, make sure I'm going the right way, asked about why these big differences, right? Because people think about these categories differently, right? When we say, were you doing even paid work, right? Paid work is, so I told you I worked on Central Asia a little bit. Standard surveys always collect data on paid work. All these household surveys collect data on paid work. The data in Kyrgyzstan is really strange. And one of the reasons that we have discovered is that people in Kyrgyzstan consider a lot of things that we would consider like socializing and leisure. They consider that work, because it's absolutely inconceivable that you would not go and visit your mother-in-law at this time in order to do this specific thing, right? It's an obligation, and people consider it as work. So all of these words, like you said, have very different interpretations, and there are feminist economists which are doing things more like interviews and ethnographic work, participant observation, and so on, to try to understand better some of these things. I mean, even decision, so, microeconomists are all about decision making. And I was mentioning before that people sometimes reduce the amount of time they're spending caring for their children in order to take up other kinds of work. It seems very important to me to understand what people are thinking. How are they making that decision? What's the thought process? Why? What do they value? What does this show us about what they value? Is it really a choice, or do they feel obligated, right? So there's a lot of work that does go on in those other ways. And actually, speaking again to the students in the crowd, you shouldn't just think about the DANE data, right? There are also many important tools that we have for other kinds of research which help us to understand these questions and these crises of care, and also around elders. So, what is a care need, right? So that question about being left at home alone all day, so should we count that as a care gap, right? Or is the fact that they're fed, clothed, bathed, does that mean they have all their needs met, right? So we have a lot to learn about what people actually see as care needs and how they think about choices in fulfilling those needs. And that would be a totally different kind of research. I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking about, but
Muchas gracias. Me parece, tal como usted ha presentado la economía feminista, articulando estos bienes que no pasan por el mercado, como es estos servicios como son el cuidado, y los bienes medioambientales a los cuales no se le da valor, como forma de interpretación que me parece muy, muy potente. Si se ha, dentro de estas líneas nuevas de investigación, no se han dado interpretaciones también sobre este tema de ahora de la nueva sociedad del conocimiento, en tanto hay una serie por ejemplo, es decir, ahora la información se considera un bien también, ¿no? Cómo nosotros estamos dando cantidad de información gratuita a todas estas redes sociales y a estos nuevos empresarios de las nuevas tecnologías que se están haciendo mega ricos con nuestra información y ahora con nuestro conocimiento, porque la inteligencia artificial pues se basa en lo que todos producimos, ¿no? Pero resulta que ahora nos van a cobrar por eso, ¿cierto? Entonces, ¿cómo se aplicaría o si se está pensando en aplicar esta interpretación también? Porque implicaría que nos tendrían que pagar por eso y no tendrían derecho a ser tan mega ricos, sino que nos tendrían que devolver parte de eso que estamos dando gratuitamente digamos, a estas nuevas, digamos, este nuevo capital pues que es transnacional del conocimiento y de la información y de las nuevas tecnologías.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think that was a little bit like your question, right, about these same things. And I think it's a great point. I don't have much to say about this. It's not something I've thought a lot about, but I think that the point is general, right? So the feminist economics point is that all these things that are contributing to economic production but don't have prices on them, we should think about all of them, right? Including the ones that you're talking about. Because all of those things are things that people are profiting from, right? Including Jeff Bezos and so on. And so we want to make that visible so that we can understand how it's contributing, you know, and maybe people should be remunerated for that, right? So I think that that's a great point. It's like an extension of what I'm talking about, but I haven't thought about those things much myself, yeah.
Okay, creo que Fabio había pedido la palabra, ¿no? Paso por acá.
Profesora, muchas gracias por la presentación. Me gustó el análisis combinado de temas ambientales y feminismo, y no es por una cuestión de especialidad, sino porque creo que estamos en una crisis civilizatoria y intentamos responder de forma integral, digamos, a esa crisis, y es reconocer al otro, reconocer a las mujeres, reconocer los otros seres, etcétera. Ese es como el punto central. Quisiera saber desde su punto de vista cómo es la integración de la heterodoxia latinoamericana en los estudios que usted realiza, si esta heterodoxia es reconocida y si hay un diálogo. Por ejemplo, la ecología política norteamericana es muy buena, surge a partir del marxismo, pero la ecología política latinoamericana, digamos, también tiene otras concepciones y otra fuerza. No sé si se unen, si usted ve las distinciones, si ve la unión, ¿cómo lo percibe?
Okay, so thank you for that question. It's a very important question, and I'm afraid I don't have a really great answer to it. But so there are a number of networking groups which are now trying to make sure that the perspectives from the thinking of political economy and heterodox economics from Latin America get better integrated into the work that people are doing in North America or in Europe and other places, right? So I'm not that familiar, I'm sorry to say, with all of it. And I've been, while I'm in Brazil, trying to read some of the books by my Brazilian colleagues so that I can familiarize myself more with it. And our organization, the International Association of Feminist Economics, has also been trying harder to get us speaking to each other by having translation, more events in Spanish and English, right? So we can hear each other, because the perspective I'm bringing is from my academic milieu, which of course is more North American and, you know, to a smaller extent European. So I don't know if there's something from the Latin American perspective that you particularly would like to add, but I appreciate you raising the point. Yeah.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Por acá creo que hay otra pregunta.
Good night. In first place, the exposition was amazing and was so interesting. And in the second place, as you say, we are in a crisis of the care system. So, what strategy or what policy do you think we can implement to stop this path? Because countries like Spain is already in this alarming crisis, and also we have policies and subsidies to stop this crisis. What do you think is another strategy for stop this crisis?
So are you asking about the crisis of care in particular?
Yes,
Yeah.
the care system.
Yeah. Do you want to add something to that? Or no. Okay. Okay. So what's the solution to the crisis? So, you know, yesterday I got a really great question from somebody at the law school at Javeriana in Bogota about the way that policies can, in fact, increase inequality instead of decreasing it, right? And I think that's a really important issue. So I don't have a particular, unfortunately, I don't have a particular strategy which is going to solve all our problems, right? But so one of the things that we've been trying, at least in Washington, I'm at American University, and we work with an organization called the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And we run a conference every year on the care economy. And one of the things we've worked very hard to do is to include labor unions and people who work on immigration in our conference. Because when we think about policies to solve the care issue, you know, the problem is that many of the care workers are poorly paid, right? And so government policies which say, well, we're going to spend more money to hire care workers, risk just becoming more exploiters, right? I saw a great panel on care in New York City where people were basically accusing the New York City government of just being a major exploiter, right? Where the New York City government was saying, wait, we're just trying to help old people, right? But the people who work with the care workers were saying, no, you know, you're just really pushing the cost onto the care workers because they're very low paid. So when we think about policy, some of the things that are really important is to think about how can we have a model where we can have care workers who are paid decently, who can be trained decently, and who can live decently so that they can provide this care. And some of the strategies which I saw very promising at the conference was having the unions work together with the, so in the United States, the funding for this kind of work goes through states as opposed to the federal government. So having the states and the unions work closely together to come up with a policy which both helps the people who need the care, but also helps the care workers, right? So that was one. And then the other thing is, in a country like the United States, but also I think in Colombia, countries depend on immigrant workers to provide that cheap labor. And so there's important to have as part of your policy to be thinking about, you know, immigration issues. So I think in Colombia, at least in Bogota, Venezuelan workers are an important part of the care sector and may be very vulnerable and have, you know, low wages and immigration vulnerability. So the trick is to find a way to fund this that works from that kind of building up the bottom of the labor force, and to have a sufficient labor supply so that when the government is trying to hire people, they are able to access an adequate and well, and you know, maybe not well paid, but decently paid. And that's one of the biggest problems, right? Care is so expensive now without raising the wages. And then if we raise the wages, it becomes more expensive. And that's why, just to go back one more time to that, whoops, where's that picture? Whoops, that one. Oops, there we go. Shoot, sorry. This one, right? Is that, look, this simulation showed what happened if we would reduce the care gap. And what we see is that the care gap, it did reduce GDP a little bit. Why? Because when you raise the wage, what happens to the demand for labor? It goes down, right? And so that's what happened there. And then you had more non-GDP work, right? That it got pushed into the other sectors. So that's the trick, right? It's a very difficult policy challenge to raise wages. If you want more care workers, you need to raise wages. And then if you raise wages, it becomes very expensive for governments, right? So that's, governments have been trying to think about that. And I think, who was it that asked me about the costs earlier? I think he's maybe not here, but That's where you have to focus on the multiplier effect, right? You economists out there, that when we pay people more, it's not just a cost because they spend that money back into the economy and there are multiplier effects, right? So we have to push on that in our Keynesian, wearing our Keynesian hats, yeah.
Yeah, hello. First, thanks for the presentation. I really appreciate that we have the space to talk about these topics in this faculty. And I have two questions. The first is about the leisure that you said. How we can include the leisures in the GDP? Because if we see that the leisure is about entertainment and these things, if we consider that we are consumers and we obtain these services, and we can see that the firms obtain benefits of this, and this is reflect in the GDP.
Yeah, right.
So the second question is about how we can make the more competitive to the women in the market, because if we see the women, we don't have a lot of opportunities to participate of the market. But what about the politics to combine that idea of be a great worker and have the labor of be a mom, like that? For example, in some parts, the firms have to try to include playgrounds for the kids that be able that the women have the time to focus to the job, and they don't care for the kids because they stay in a safe place. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll do the leisure first. So, okay, you raise a great point. So many things that we consume during leisure are already in GDP, right? You go to the movies, that's in GDP. You go to the tennis club, that's in GDP. Whatever you do for your leisure, a lot of it is in GDP. So it's already there. So what we're talking about adding is your time in GDP, right? The value that you put on using your time, having leisure time, right? I'm watching TV, right? Or I'm whatever, your leisure time. And do you know how we value that? Does anybody have a thought? Like, how are we going to put a value on the time that I spend, my time in leisure? Anybody have a thought? So in environmental economics and also in labor economics, there's a tool that we use called willingness to pay, right? Or willingness to accept. Is anybody familiar with this? Like so we use this for measuring, so some workers, the idea is that workers who do risky jobs get paid higher wages because they're taking on a risk, right? And so we're trying to figure out, well, how much is the value of the additional wage for taking a risky job? And what we do is we ask workers, how much extra wage would you need to get if you had to increase your risk of dying at your job by 0.0001%? How much would you pay? And we do this is for real. I know it sounds a little weird, but it's for real. And then you can ask the question the other way. How much money would you accept to increase your risk of dying at work by 0.0001%? And as an economist, it should be the same. What your willingness to accept for increasing to die should be the same amount that you would pay to avoid dying. It should be the same, but it's never the same. People offer very different amounts, okay? But we have a method for valuing things that don't have a price tag that's called willingness to pay or willingness to accept. And we also use this for environmental things, like how much would you be willing to pay to save the pandas? And people say, oh, I'd give $1 every month for the rest of my life. That's willingness to pay, right? So you can do that for leisure. How much would you be willing to pay to have an extra hour of leisure a week, right? And people could say. And then how much would you accept to have 1 hour less of leisure a week. And then you could say, and they would be two different numbers, and we'd have to decide which one to use, right? But that's a way of putting the price on those things, yeah. So the question about women working in businesses, I didn't quite understand the question. So yeah, so can you restate the question again about the women in work? I didn't quite understand the...
Yeah, but my question is focusing what policies or my tools we can give to the women for have more participation or maybe be more competitive in the market, no, in the job. Yep. Because if we see the idea that the maybe women want to be mothers, she have to invest more time in the task of care, and they invest less time in your career.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great point. And you know, that's the $1 million question right now, because of the problem of aging, so many governments are asking this question, right? The South Korean government, the Japanese government, the United States government. Trump is saying he's going to give $5,000 to women who have a baby, right? All the governments are really asking this question: what's the policy? And you know, women and so in South Korea and China for so many years had a policy you can only have one child. But now China's like, uh-oh, aging crisis, please have more children. And China and Russia are offering all these incentives to women to have children. And women are like, nope, no. Why? Like, what, how? And you know, I'm not sure all the reasons, but a lot of the survey evidence suggests that it's what's called the double burden, right? Young women look at this problem of like, okay, I'm going to have this work, and I'm going to try to raise my child, and my spouse isn't going to help me that much, and the government isn't going to help me that much, and no, I'm not going to crush myself in that way, right? So the question is, what is the policy? Some of the answer seems to be, you know, this issue of childcare, right? And having good quality childcare that actually lasts the whole length of your working day, so you're not crazy trying to run, you know, to the childcare center. That's one. And so we have, in Feminist Economics, we have this thing that's called reduce. Okay, that's have the state give you some policy so you don't have so much care to provide. And then the next thing we do, reduce and redistribute. And that is that men and women should do these things more equally, right? Because right now, it's the women who are suffering the loss of productivity that you pointed out at work, right? Because they have children. Why are men not suffering that loss of productivity at work, right? So the argument is that we should redistribute this. If both men and women have the same, then there's not going to be that gender discrimination in labor markets, right? And so what are the answers there? Extend paternity leave. I know that Colombia right now in the parliament, or the Congress rather, is considering a bill to extend paternity leave. Paternity leave is very important because what happens in the first few weeks of a child's life affects the distribution of care between the parents for the child's whole life. So Sweden has a very long paternity leave, but men don't have to take paternity leave. It's not required. And so there are studies in Sweden looking at men who take paternity leave and men who don't, and trying to make them as comparable as possible, these men. And what we know is that men who take paternity leave are more involved with their children over the whole course of their lives, which means that the women in those families have more equal opportunities to participate in the labor force, right? So reduce the obligation on families, but then also redistribute the care within the household so that it's more equal, right? So that everybody, and also I want to say that there's a huge amount of literature which shows that men who participate more in the care of their babies are happier in their marriages and in their lives than men who do not, right? So I actually wrote a paper on the sharing of care between couples and marital satisfaction using data from Kazakhstan. But so I reviewed all the literature, of course, for this paper, right? And so it's very interesting literature that shows that men who do more care are happier, right? But it's really interesting if you look at the sharing of care. Men like to do more care, but they also like their partner to do more care, right? So they like to do more care, but they don't like it to get too equal. They still think that women should do more care. So we have a little ways to go on that. So we shouldn't think that men who when we redistribute, we shouldn't think, oh, that's going to make all the men unhappy. No, that's not true, actually. And I don't know in Colombia, but in the United States, there's a lot of survey evidence which shows that men would rather, on average, would rather do less work and do a little bit more care. Again, I'm not saying they want to be stay-at-home dads, but they just would like to redistribute a little bit and not have to work so much and have more time to get to know their kids and spend time with them and so on. So I don't think it's a lose for the men to do that redistribution.
Mieke, thank you for this long journey. My question is about this model. What will be an economic reason to put the same 15% to these different groups?
That's a great question.
And finally, I have a comment. I really liked this idea from Feminist Economics about economic growth is a tool for human well-being, because this idea pays attention in whole population and it doesn't divide in producers first and consumers second. Thank you.
Great, I'm glad you liked that. I think this was completely arbitrary. I actually am not a co-author on this study, but I think that they didn't spend a lot of time figuring out what should be the ratio of childcare and elder care. Yeah, so I think it was completely arbitrary. And I think it's a really good question because, all children require care, right? Every child. But not all elders require care, right? Many people up to 90 years old don't need any help. And then there are people who are 65 years old and need a lot of help, right? So how to figure out what would be the right ratio of spending is kind of complicated. And I think they just were like, well, never mind, we're just going to make it equal.
Thank you.
Okay, is there one more question? Professor Carlos? No? Another question or no? Okay, I think it's enough. Bueno, pues quiero agradecer con creces esta interesante discusión que se ha generado. Creo que ha sido una discusión muy profunda y muy amplia que nos muestra justamente nuevas perspectivas para el análisis económico y un análisis quizá más completo, más amplio y quizá que nos permita pensar en nuevas teorías del valor y en cómo cambiar el mundo. Entonces, agradezco de nuevo con creces a la profesora Meurs y a todos los asistentes y de manera muy especial también al decano, a la profesora Pilar por habernos hecho la conexión con la profesora Meurs. Y los invitamos afuera a un compartir para que, por favor, terminemos el evento. Presentation, I think, yeah, because also we have like a very interesting dialogue.
Yes.
All of us.
Right, I try not to talk too much because people like to engage and they have a lot of things to say. Everybody, every time is different.
Yeah, but it was, I think, very clear, your presentation. I think each one understood everything because it's very clear.
We're courageous with their English too, really nice.
Yeah, yeah, we make an effort.
Yes, it's really great. Thank you.
So, okay, I think we can go out and I don't know if we can take some photos.
Oh, sure.
I said it.